The word left her mouth before she could call it back, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Emma Shepard had ever heard in her life. 37 weeks, Phineas Hunter said, and his voice was so low and controlled that it frightened her more than shouting ever could have. He was standing at the window of the farmhouse kitchen, his back to her, one hand braced against the wooden frame, and the amber light of the October afternoon carved the tension in his shoulders into something that looked like grief. "I counted them, Emma, every single one of them. Monday mornings when I'd wake up and think, this is the week she'll tell me she's leaving, and you never did. And I never asked. Phineas, you said 1 week." He turned then, and the expression on his face broke something open inside her chest. It was not anger, though anger would have been easier. It was the raw, unguarded face of a man who had been carrying a secret so heavy it had bent the shape of him. "You told Doc Harlan you needed 1 week to sort out your sister's affairs, settle the house, and get back on the stage to Abilene. 1 week, Emma. That was October of last year." She stood in the center of that kitchen she had come to know better than any room she had ever lived in, surrounded by the smells of wood smoke and coffee, and the faint sweetness of the apple preserves she had put up herself not 3 days ago, and she could not speak. The truth was rising in her like floodwater, and she had been pressing it down so long that the effort of containing it had become the whole architecture of her daily life. "I know," she finally said. "I know it was 1 week. Then why didn't you go?" The question hung between them in the dry Kansas air, and outside the window behind him she could see the tallgrass prairie stretching out gold and bronze in the late afternoon light, the same view she had looked at every morning for 37 weeks without once allowing herself to say what it meant to her. What he meant to her. She had come to Caldera Creek because of her sister. She had stayed because of him. And the forbidden beauty of that fact had kept her silent through the greening of spring, the scorching press of summer, and now into the cooling amber of a second autumn, and the silence had grown so large between them that breaking it felt like detonating something neither of them could survive. But Phineas Hunter was looking at her like a man who had already decided he would rather burn than keep pretending the fire wasn't there. And Emma Shepard, who had spent her whole life being careful, took a breath and let herself burn too. It had started a year and a month ago, on a Tuesday morning in September of 1878, when the westbound stage from Abilene rolled into the drought-cracked streets of Caldera Creek, Kansas, carrying 3 passengers, a strongbox belonging to the Second National Bank, and one Emma Shepard of Cincinnati, Ohio, who had a one-way ticket and a heart full of complicated grief. She was 26 years old. She had brown hair that she wore in a practical knot at the nape of her neck, gray eyes that people frequently described as thoughtful and less frequently as unreadable, and hands that were already showing the early roughness of a woman who had spent the better part of 2 years managing a household on her own after her mother died. She wore a dark wool traveling dress that had been fashionable 4 years ago, and carried a leather satchel that contained 2 changes of clothing, a well-worn copy of Jane Eyre, a small wooden box of her sister's letters, and $53.40, which was nearly all the money she had in the world. Her sister, Clara Shepard Waverly, had died of typhoid fever in early August of 1878, leaving behind a modest homestead on the outskirts of Caldera Creek, a husband named George Waverly, who had preceded her in death by 6 months due to a horse-related accident, and a tangle of legal and practical affairs that a letter from a man named Aldous Harlan, who served as both the town's doctor and its self-appointed administrator of community concerns, suggested could not be sorted out without a representative of Clara's family being present in person. Emma had come because she was the only family left. She had come because she owed Clara that much, and perhaps more. She had come because Cincinnati in the late summer of her grief felt like a room with all the air removed, and even a difficult journey into the Kansas interior seemed preferable to the slow suffocation of staying still. She had not come expecting anything except paperwork and dust. The first time she saw Phineas Hunter, He was pulling a wagon out of a mud sink on the road between the stage stop and Main Street, which was an inauspicious beginning for a man who would turn out to be the most significant person she had ever met. He had a rope over one shoulder and was talking quietly to the panicked horses the way other men talked to firearms, with the low, certain authority of someone who understood the instrument completely and held no fear of it. He was tall, perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of lean, weathered build that came from years of physical labor rather than any particular intention. His hat was shoved back on his head. There was mud on his forearm up to the elbow. He looked up when the stage passed, and their eyes met for exactly the duration of one breath, and then the stage moved on and Emma looked away first. She thought nothing of it at the time. She thought nothing of it because she was focused on the task she had come to complete. 1 week, she had told herself. She would spend 1 week settling Clara's affairs. The house needed to be appraised and either sold or transferred. There were debts to be accounted for, and Doc Harlan had mentioned in his letter that there were some personal effects that needed sorting. And then she would take the eastbound stage back to Abilene and catch the train home to Cincinnati and begin the entirely unclear project of figuring out what her life was supposed to look like now. That was the plan. 1 week. Clean, simple, and bounded by specific purpose. The plan began unraveling on the second day. Doc Harlan, who turned out to be a small, bespectacled, relentlessly cheerful man of 60 who smelled of pipe tobacco and seemed to regard every human difficulty as an interesting puzzle, explained over coffee in his front office that Clara's affairs were considerably more tangled than his letter had suggested. "The house itself is straightforward," he said, peering at her over his spectacles. "Clara owned it outright after George died, and as her nearest kin you're the inheritor. But there's a debt attached to the property. George borrowed money before he passed from the Meridian Land Company, which is one of those Eastern investment concerns that's been buying up homesteads throughout the county. They hold a lien on the property. The debt is $80. Emma set down her coffee cup. $80, with 4 months of interest added since George's passing, closer to 92. She did not have $92. She had $53.40, and the stage ticket home would cost her 8 of those. She looked at Doc Harlan with the calm, measured expression she had developed as a defense mechanism over the past 2 years of managing difficult situations with insufficient resources, and she said, "Is there any possibility of selling the house to cover the debt?" "In theory, yes. In practice, the Meridian Land Company has filed a legal hold preventing sale until the debt is settled. It's a trap they use regularly, I'm afraid. They want the land, so they make it impossible to sell without paying them first, and most of the people they target don't have the cash." Doc Harlan sighed. "It's an injustice, Miss Shepard, and I apologize that you've walked into the middle of it. I should have explained it more fully in my letter." Emma spent the rest of that second day sitting in Clara's empty house, which was small and neat and achingly familiar in the way that a dead person's arranged belongings always were, carrying the ghost of deliberate choices, doing arithmetic in her head, and arriving at no satisfying conclusions. She needed $39 she did not have, and no way to earn it in the amount of time she had allotted herself, and no clear path forward. It was on the morning of the third day that Phineas Hunter came to fix Clara's fence. She was standing in the front doorway with a cup of coffee when he rode up, a fence post balanced across the front of his saddle in a way that seemed to require a specific understanding of counterbalance. He looked at the sagging section of split-rail fence along the property's north edge, then looked at her. "You're Miss Shepard," he said. It was not a question. "I am Phineas Hunter. I have the farm adjacent to this property, east side. Clara and I had an agreement about this fence line. I was meant to fix this section before winter, and I'm late on it. I told her July. I want to honor the agreement." Emma looked at him. The morning light was clear and still, the kind of September morning that felt like a promise Kansas would only keep for another few weeks before the cold came in. He was sitting his horse with the relaxed economy of a man who had been on horseback since before he could properly remember, and he was looking at her with an expression of straightforward, uncomplicated courtesy that she found, after 2 days of legal tangles and grief and the general low-grade anxiety of being alone in an unfamiliar place, almost overwhelming in its simplicity. "Clara died in August," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry. She was a good neighbor." He paused. "I still want to fix the fence." She stepped back from the doorway. "Would you like coffee when you're done?" Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the controlled predecessor to one. "Thank you, I would." He fixed the fence in an hour and a half, working with the same quiet efficiency she had observed from the stage window. And when he came to the back door, she poured him coffee and they sat across the kitchen table from each other and talked. And the talking was so easy and natural that afterward Emma could not account for how it had happened. She was not, by nature, a person who found conversation easy with strangers. She had always been the quiet sister, the careful one, the one who held things close and let Clara do the talking. But Phineas Hunter asked questions that were genuinely curious rather than intrusive, and he listened to the answers in a way that made her feel that what she was saying actually landed somewhere rather than simply dispersing into the air. She told him about Cincinnati. She told him about her mother's death and Clara's marriage to George, and the 2 years of managing the family house alone while her savings dwindled. She did not tell him about the debt, because that felt private and still unresolved. She told him about the 1-week plan. He told her about his farm. He had come to Caldera Creek in 1873, 5 years earlier at the age of 25, with a land deed and a determination to build something that was entirely his own. He had 600 acres of mixed grassland and creek bottom, a solid house he had built himself over the course of 2 winters, a small cattle operation, and a kitchen garden that he maintained with a seriousness that made Emma suspect the kitchen garden was important to him, in a way he would not directly admit. "What brought you out here specifically?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup. "Dark past," he said, and the 2 words carried a weight that told her they were the abbreviated version of a longer truth. "I needed somewhere that hadn't already decided who I was." She understood that completely. She did not press. He left in the early afternoon, and Emma watched him ride east until the grass swallowed him, and she stood there in the doorway of her dead sister's house for a long time, holding her empty coffee cup, and she thought, 1 week. She still had 1 week. But that same evening, something shifted in the arithmetic of her situation. Doc Harlan sent word that there might be a solution to the Meridian Land Company problem, but it would take time to pursue. A lawyer from Dodge City named Beaumont had successfully challenged similar liens on behalf of several homesteaders, and Doc Harlan believed he could draft a letter to Beaumont that might initiate a legal challenge. However, such things moved slowly. It might take several weeks. Emma wrote back that she would stay until the situation was clearer. 1 week became 2. She told herself it was purely practical. She needed to protect Clara's estate. She needed to see the debt matter resolved so that the house could be properly sold, and the proceeds, whatever remained after the debt was settled, could be returned to Clara's memory in some meaningful way. Perhaps a donation to the church Clara had attended, or a contribution toward the small schoolhouse that Doc Harlan mentioned. The town had been trying to fund for 2 years. She told herself it had nothing to do with the fact that Phineas Hunter rode over on Saturday morning of that first week to see if she needed any supplies brought from town, and stayed for 3 hours, and they sat on Clara's front porch watching the last of the summer heat shimmer over the prairie grass and talked about books, of all things. He had a shelf of them in his house, worn-spined and annotated in pencil. And he had strong opinions about Dickens that she found herself arguing with vigorously and enjoyably, in a way she had not argued about anything in years. 2 weeks became 3. Doc Harlan had received a response from the lawyer Beaumont. The situation was promising, but required additional documentation from the county land office in Wichita, which Doc Harlan was in the process of obtaining. He was very sorry for the delay. Emma wrote back that she would stay. She had found, by this point, that she had fallen into a rhythm in Caldera Creek that was startling in how naturally it had organized itself. She had taken on the task of sorting Clara's belongings properly, something that required more emotional energy than she had anticipated and more time than she had budgeted, and she had made an arrangement with a widow named Mrs. Fay Tully, who ran the town's one boarding house, paying a reduced rate in exchange for helping with the cooking 3 mornings a week. This small economy stretched her money further, which was a relief. She had also, without entirely planning it, become a fixture at the Saturday morning market on Main Street, which was where the farms and homesteads in the surrounding area sold produce and goods to the town's permanent residents. It was there, on the 3rd Saturday of her stay, that she first saw the fullness of what Caldera Creek actually was, not just a dusty frontier town, but a genuine community of people who were making something difficult and precarious, and real in a landscape that was by turns breathtakingly beautiful and brutally unforgiving. Phineas was at the market with a cart of late-season vegetables, tomatoes and squash and dried beans, and she found herself gravitating toward his cart with a naturalness that she did not examine too closely. "Still here," he observed, but not unkindly. There was something in the way he said it that suggested he had noticed and was glad. "The legal matter is taking longer than expected," she said. "Kansas things usually do," he said, and handed her a squash. She paid him 3 cents for it, and the transaction felt like a covenant. 3 weeks became 4 and then 5, and the days began to compress into a texture that Emma could feel changing beneath her hands the way bread dough changed, becoming something coherent, something with structure, something that would hold its shape. She learned the rhythms of the town. She learned which of Mrs. Tully's boarders were merely passing through, and which had arrived with that particular quality of restlessness that meant they were considering stopping. She learned that the barber, a meticulous man named Cleet Marsh, was also the best source of local information, and that Doc Harlan's cheerfulness concealed a deep and genuine concern for the well-being of everyone within 20 miles of his office. She learned that Thursday afternoons had a particular quality of stillness in Caldera Creek, and that the best time to walk to the creek for which the town was named was the hour before sunset, when the light went horizontal and the water turned the color of old copper. She learned these things, and she learned them in the company of Phineas Hunter more often than she did not. He had a habit of appearing. She could not call it pursuit, because it was never that insistent or that obvious. It was more that the geography of Caldera Creek and the natural patterns of its small community meant that their paths crossed with a frequency that could have been coincidence if she had believed in coincidence, which she was increasingly uncertain she did. He appeared at the market on Saturdays. He appeared at Doc Harlan's on a Tuesday afternoon when she was there discussing the legal matter, because he was there to collect some medicine for one of his farmhands who had a persistent cough. He appeared at the creek one Thursday evening in late September, fishing from the near bank with a patience that she recognized as a quality she admired in people, and they sat near each other without talking for 40 minutes, and it was among the most comfortable silences she had ever occupied. "You're not a man who requires conversation to feel at ease," she said finally. "No," he said. "Are you?" "I used to think I was," she said. "I've changed my mind." He pulled his line in and looked at her. The last of the October light was turning the creek orange, and the world around them was very still. "What changed it?" "I'm not sure yet," she said, which was entirely honest. He nodded as though that was a satisfying answer. By the 6th week, Emma had admitted to herself that she was no longer staying primarily because of the legal matter with the Meridian Land Company, though that was still unresolved and still required her presence. She was staying because Caldera Creek had begun to feel like something she did not have a word for yet. Because the mornings when she cooked at Mrs. Tully's had a rightness to them that her mornings in Cincinnati had not possessed for years. Because the Saturday markets had become the week's fixed point, its North Star. Because there was a man with a farm to the east who lent her books and argued about Dickens, and sat quietly beside the creek and had said, "Dark past," with two words that held the weight of a whole life, and she found herself assembling the shape of that life from the small details he offered, like a person fitting together a puzzle of which they had only every third or fourth piece. She knew very little about his past, and she wanted to know everything. What she knew was this: he was from Virginia originally. He had come west after the war, not immediately but after a period of years that he did not characterize precisely. He had tried 3 places before Caldera Creek. He mentioned Missouri and Nebraska in passing, but never with the attachment that colored his voice when he talked about Kansas. He had lost someone, she was fairly certain, though he never named them. There was a quality in the way he spoke about solitude, not romantically but practically, the way a man speaks about a tool he has learned to use because it was the only one available, that told her he had spent a long time alone and had made his peace with it in a way that sometimes looked like preference but was probably closer to accommodation. He was 30 years old. He was careful with his words and careless with his kindness, by which she meant that the kindness was not calculated or rationed the way his words were, but simply emerged, constant and unannounced, in the small actions that composed his days. The fence he fixed for a dead woman's agreement, the supplies offered to a stranger staying in a dead woman's house, the extra apple he tucked into the market bag of Mrs. Dunmore, the elderly woman 3 farms over who had no one to run errands for her. Emma noticed all of it. She noticed it the way you notice something that illuminates rather than merely informs, the way a lamp makes a room make sense. By the 8th week, the lawyer Beaumont had made progress. He had located a precedent from an 1876 case in Sedgwick County that could potentially invalidate the Meridian Land Company's lien on the grounds of improper filing procedures. He needed another 2 weeks to prepare the formal challenge. Emma wrote back that she would stay. She did not examine the disproportionate relief she felt at having an extension of her justification. She simply noted it, the way she was increasingly in the habit of noting things about herself without acting on them immediately, and set the letter aside. It was in the 9th week that the first complication arrived, wearing the shape of a man named Denton Cray. Cray was an agent of the Meridian Land Company, which Emma knew because Doc Harlan told her so with an expression of pronounced distaste. He had arrived in Caldera Creek on a Monday, checked into Mrs. Tully's boarding house, which meant Emma saw him at breakfast, and began making inquiries about various properties in the area, including Clara's homestead. He was perhaps 45, well-dressed by frontier standards, with a smooth manner that Emma recognized as the kind of smoothness that comes not from genuine ease, but from long practice at concealing its absence. He was pleasant to her at breakfast, inquired about her situation with what seemed like casual interest, and offered on the 2nd day to simplify matters by purchasing the property directly from her for $60, debt included. "That would leave you with approximately nothing," Emma said. "It would leave you free to return home," Cray said, with a smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "I'm not ready to return home," she said. Something hardened behind the smile. "These legal challenges rarely succeed," he said. "The company has considerable experience with them. I'm offering you a clean exit." "Thank you," Emma said. "No." She told Phineas about the encounter that Saturday at the market, and she watched his expression do something controlled and careful. He was quiet for a moment, arranging and rearranging a stack of dried bean packets with more attention than they required. "Cray's been here before," he said finally. 2 years ago. He tried to buy the Kellerman farm through the same method: lien, delay, pressure, lowball offer. Kellerman took it because he was desperate. Lost 300 acres of good creek bottom for about 1/3 of its value. He paused. "Don't take his offer, Emma. It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal prefix, and the naturalness of it landed in the middle of her chest like a struck match. "I wasn't going to," she said. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to say it anyway." The second complication arrived in the 11th week, and it was internal rather than external, which made it considerably harder to manage. She was sitting at Clara's kitchen table on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, reading one of the books Phineas had lent her, a battered copy of Thoreau's Walden, heavily annotated in pencil in a handwriting she was coming to recognize as thoroughly as her own, when she admitted to herself, cleanly and without any of the usual defensive cushioning, that she was in love with Phineas Hunter. It was not a small realization or an easy one. It was the kind of realization that rearranges the furniture of your understanding of your own life, that makes you look back over the preceding weeks and see the shape you had been moving in without recognizing it as a shape. She had been falling for months slowly, with all the gradual certainty of a prairie creek filling after rain, and only now, holding his annotated book in her hands in her dead sister's kitchen in a town she had planned to leave after 1 week, did she reach the bottom of the fall and understand where she had arrived. The question of what to do with this understanding was not simple. She did not know if he felt anything corresponding. She suspected, she hoped, which was a word she had been cautious with since her mother died, but hoping and knowing were very different currencies, and she had spent enough of her life on poorly backed hope to have developed a respect for the distinction. She also had still the matter of her actual life. Cincinnati existed. She had no income, no clear purpose in Caldera Creek, and no permanent right to occupy her dead sister's house, which was technically in legal limbo and would need to be resolved and disposed of in some fashion. She was a woman alone in the frontier with $53 minus $8 for the return ticket, which she had not purchased because she kept not purchasing it, and the Meridian Land Company's agent was staying 3 rooms down the hall from her at Mrs. Tully's boarding house and smiling at her over eggs every morning. She closed the Thoreau and sat with it on her lap for a long time, listening to the rain on the roof, and she thought, "I am not ready to go. I am not ready to go yet. I will stay a little longer. 1 more week." The weeks accumulated the way snowfall accumulates, silently, individually unremarkable, and then suddenly you look and the whole landscape has been transformed, and you cannot point to the single moment it happened. Week 12 brought an early cold snap, and Phineas appearing at her door with 2 cords of firewood he had cut from his own stand of cottonwood trees. He stacked it himself without asking whether she wanted help, and she made coffee and they sat by the fire afterward, and he told her about Virginia for the first time, not the dark past of it, not yet, but the physical geography, the blue mountains and the red soil and the particular smell of Virginia in early spring. And she could hear in his voice the specific kind of longing that belongs to people who have loved a place and left it and cannot return. And she ached for him in a way that felt like recognition. Week 13 brought the arrival of a letter from Cincinnati. It was from a woman named Agnes Prell, who had been her mother's neighbor and a mild acquaintance of Emma's, and it contained the information, delivered with well-meaning bluntness, that the house Emma had been renting in Cincinnati had been let to another tenant, the landlord having assumed after 2 months that she was not returning. Agnes had packed Emma's remaining belongings into 3 trunks, and they were being held at the shipping office pending her instructions. Emma read this letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the wooden box alongside Clara's letters and went outside and stood in the cold air of the November morning and looked east, toward Phineas Hunter's farm, and felt something click into a new position inside her. She had not had a home in Cincinnati for 3 months. She had been, without quite acknowledging it, becoming a resident of Caldera Creek. The thought of this did not frighten her the way it might have frightened her in September. The thought of it, she realized, felt like relief. Week 14. Denton Cray made a second offer on the property, this time in writing, through a formal document that he had apparently prepared in advance. He slid it under her door at Mrs. Tully's with a note that said the offer was time-sensitive and would expire at the end of the month. Emma took the document to Doc Harlan, who examined it and shook his head. He's added a clause. If you refuse the offer and the legal challenge fails, the company will pursue the full debt plus accumulated interest and legal fees. He's trying to frighten you. I know, Emma said. Is the legal challenge likely to succeed? Doc Harlan tilted his hand from side to side in the universal gesture of cautious optimism. Beaumont thinks so, but there are no guarantees. Then I'll take the risk, Emma said. She refused Cray's offer in writing that same afternoon, and when she passed him at breakfast the next morning, his pleasantness had a different temperature, still smooth, still courteous, but with an edge beneath it that told her he was not a man accustomed to being refused. She felt the first genuine unease she had experienced since arriving, a cold awareness that the stakes were real and that she was the one carrying them. Phineas noticed at the Saturday market that something was different. "You're worried," he said. It was not an accusation, just an observation, the kind of clean, accurate statement he made that she had learned to trust precisely because he did not make careless ones. "I refused Cray's second offer," she said. "He didn't take it graciously." Phineas set down what he was doing. "Did he threaten you?" "Not explicitly," she said, "but he made the consequences feel more real." There was a pause in which she watched him making a decision of some kind, working through it with the same careful internal process she had observed in him before when something mattered. Then he said, "I want to tell you something about Cray, and about the Meridian Land Company." They walked to the end of the market, away from the Saturday crowd, and stood near the horses. Phineas spoke quietly, with his eyes on the middle distance. "When Cray came through 2 years ago and took the Kellerman farm," he said, "I was not a passive observer. I went to Cray and I told him what I thought of his methods. It did not go well. He has a long memory and he uses information as a weapon. He spent 2 weeks afterward asking around town about my past, my history." He paused. "I came to Caldera Creek to leave certain things behind. There are people who would rather I not have managed it." "What people?" she asked. He looked at her then, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had seen from him, stripped of the careful control, showing the thing beneath it. "In Virginia, before the war, my family lost everything through a combination of bad judgment and worse luck. After the war, I came west through some places and situations I'm not proud of. I made choices I can't entirely excuse. Nothing criminal, I want to be clear about that, but the kind of choices that acquire enemies." "What kind of choices?" she asked, because she needed to know, not out of judgment but out of the specific hunger of someone who cares deeply and needs the full truth. He was quiet for a long moment. "I worked for a land company in Missouri for 2 years, he said. "Not the Meridian Company, a different one, but the same kind. I didn't know when I started what they actually did. When I understood it, I left. But I'd done work for them in the meantime that I can't undo, and there are people who lost land because of the company I worked for." He said this looking at her directly, watching for her reaction with a steadiness that told her he had been afraid of this conversation and was having it anyway. "You left when you understood," she said. "That's a thin justification." "It's not nothing," she said. "And you've been fixing fences and leaving firewood and carrying medicine across farms for 5 years. That's not nothing either." Something shifted in his face. The relief in it was almost painful to see. He said nothing for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, "Cray knows I worked for a land company in Missouri. If he starts digging, he can find the names attached to that work. It could complicate things." "Is that why you're telling me?" she asked. "No," he said. "I'm telling you because you have a right to know who you're trusting." She looked at him for a long moment in the thin winter light. The prairie around them was frost-pale, the sky the flat white of a Kansas November, and he was standing in the center of it with his secrets laid out between them like cards on a table, letting her decide what to do with them. "I'm not going to think less of you for this," she said. He nodded once, slow. "I know," he said. "I think that's part of why I told you." Week 15. Emma wrote to her trunks in Cincinnati and had them shipped to Caldera Creek. She did not tell Phineas she had done this. She did not tell anyone, though she suspected Mrs. Tully noticed, because Mrs. Tully noticed everything and had, in her way, become something like a friend. But she needed to do it quietly, for herself, as an acknowledgement of what she had already decided without quite deciding it. The trunks arrived 10 days later, and she stacked them in Clara's bedroom and felt, for the first time, that the house had a future rather than merely a past. Week 16 brought a development in the legal matter. Beaumont had filed the challenge. The Meridian Land Company had 3 weeks to respond. Week 17. Cray was still in Caldera Creek, still at Mrs. Tully's, and his patience had a coiled quality that made Emma conscious of it whenever they shared the dining room. He had stopped making direct conversation with her, which was in some ways more unsettling than his previous pleasantness. It was in the 17th week that Phineas Hunter, for the first time, did something that was unambiguously personal rather than neighborly. He brought her flowers. They were not romantic flowers in the fashionable sense. There was no florist within 50 miles of Caldera Creek, but a careful collection of the last dried prairie grasses and the seed heads of the tallgrass species that grew along his creek bottom, arranged with a precision that told her he had thought about it, tied with a piece of twine and left on her doorstep on a Thursday morning with a note that said only, "For your windowsill. P.H." She put them on the windowsill of Clara's kitchen. She looked at them every morning for the next 3 weeks without moving them. Week 18. She and Phineas had dinner together for the first time at the hotel dining room in town, which was the closest Caldera Creek came to a restaurant, and it was not quite a formal occasion, and not quite an informal one either, occupying the charged and delicate space between them that had been building since the 3rd day she was there. They talked for 3 hours over food that was mediocre and coffee that was exceptional, and she told him things she had not told anyone since Clara died, about the particular texture of her grief, which was not clean and simple but complicated by the distance that had grown between them in Clara's last years, by the letters that were warm but cautious, by the sense that there were things Clara had wanted to say to her that had never quite been said. "She wrote to me once," Emma said, "that she had finally found the kind of life she'd been trying to describe in all her previous letters, that she understood what she'd been looking for. She died 3 weeks after writing it." Phineas was quiet for a moment. "What do you think she meant?" "I think she meant she was home," Emma said. "Really home, not just in a place but in a life she'd built that fit her." She paused. "I didn't understand what she meant when I read it. I think I'm beginning to." He looked at her across the table, and there was something in his eyes that she had been careful not to name for months, and she was careful not to name it now either, because they were both, she understood, people who needed to arrive at things in their own time, and she would not rush what was coming by reaching for it before it was ready. But it was coming. She could feel the whole weight of it in the air between them, patient and enormous like weather. Week 19. The Meridian Land Company responded to Beaumont's challenge with a counterfiling that introduced new complications. Beaumont remained optimistic, but the timeline extended. Emma had stopped counting the weeks as obstacles to overcome and started experiencing them as what they actually were. She began, quietly in the 20th week, to make the house her own. Small things. A set of curtains for the kitchen window, bought from Mrs. Dunmore, who sold dry goods. A rag rug she made herself over the course of 3 evenings from strips of old fabric she found in Clara's scrap basket. A small kitchen garden she prepared in a sheltered corner of the south-facing yard. Though it was winter and the planting was months off, she turned the soil and amended it with compost, preparing it for spring. When Phineas came by on a Saturday afternoon and saw the turned earth, he stopped and looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. "I know," she said. "It's December. The planting is in March." "I know when planting is," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "I was just thinking about what that means." She met his eyes. "I know what it means," she said. He nodded slowly. "I'm glad," he said. That was all, but the 2 words had the weight of a declaration. Weeks 20 through 25 carried Caldera Creek through the deep cold of a Kansas winter, and Emma Shepard, who had never lived through a prairie winter and had been warned by nearly everyone she knew that they were severe, found that the severity was true and the beauty was truer. The prairie under snow was a different country, spare and enormous and achingly white. The sky a cold blue that had no equivalent in Ohio, the wind a physical presence rather than merely a weather condition. Phineas taught her to manage the cold, how to bank a fire properly, how to judge the quality of ice on the creek, how to read the particular color of the sky that meant a storm was 2 hours away rather than 2 days. He taught her these things practically and without condescension, in the way he taught everything, as though the information were simply available and she were simply interested, which she was. She taught him things too. She was better read than he was, though not by as much as she had assumed at first, and she had a facility with numbers and accounts that proved useful when he was trying to calculate the economics of his spring cattle purchase. They worked through it together at his kitchen table one February afternoon, his farm ledger between them, and at some point she looked up and found him watching her with an expression she had no defenses left against, and she felt the warmth of it go through her like sunlight through glass. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking." She looked back down at the ledger. Her hand, she noticed, was very close to his on the table. Neither of them moved. It was in the 26th week, February of 1879, 5 months into what was supposed to have been 1 week, that Denton Cray did something that could not be ignored. He went to Phineas Hunter with information. Emma did not learn the details until afterward, but she learned enough. Cray had assembled what he could of Phineas's Missouri history and presented it to him as a threat. Either Phineas could use his influence with Emma to persuade her to accept the Meridian Company's offer on the property, or Cray would take his information to the county sheriff and make claims about Phineas's past that, while technically within the range of ambiguity, would be damaging and difficult to disprove. Phineas came to Emma that same evening. He told her everything, his voice controlled but with something underneath it she had not heard before, something that sounded like it was reaching the end of a long patience. "He's using you to get to me," Emma said when he had finished. "He's using me to get to you," Phineas corrected. "The property is what he wants. I'm just the lever." "What did you tell him?" "I told him to present whatever evidence he had to whatever authority he liked," Phineas said. "And then I came here." She looked at him. The lamp was burning between them on the kitchen table, and his face was very clear in the light, and she thought, this man, this particular, careful, complicated, deeply good man. "He won't stop," she said. "No," Phineas agreed. "Then we need to move faster than he does," she said, and reached across the table and closed her hand over his. He looked down at their hands and then up at her face, and for a moment neither of them moved, and then his hand turned beneath hers and closed around it. And that was the first time they touched with intention, with the full weight of what they were to each other behind it. "Beaumont needs to file before Cray can make a move with the sheriff," Emma said. "If the lien is legally invalidated, Cray's leverage is gone. The property issue is resolved. And whatever he says about your past, you have 5 years of this community behind you." "That's practical," Phineas said. "I can be practical," she said, and she was smiling, and he looked at her smile with an expression that she felt in every part of her. "Emma," he said, and then stopped. "Phineas," she said. He shook his head, but slowly, with a kind of wondering quality. "How did you end up here?" he said. "You were supposed to stay 1 week." "I know," she said. "I keep meaning to leave." "Don't," he said. The word was simple and direct, and it contained absolutely everything. "I won't," she said. They wrote to Beaumont the next morning. Emma's letter was urgent and specific, laying out Cray's threat and the timeline it imposed. Phineas added his own letter, signed, attesting to the integrity of the challenge and the history of the Meridian Company's practices in Caldera Creek specifically. Doc Harlan added a third letter, from his position as the community's most trusted figure, describing both cases, Kellerman's and Clara's, and their impact. Beaumont filed the formal challenge with the Sedgwick County Court in the 28th week. In the 29th week, Cray made good on part of his threat. He went to the county sheriff, not the Caldera Creek town marshal, who was a pragmatic man named Stokes who had lived beside Phineas for years and held him in regard, but the county sheriff in Wichita, to whom Phineas was an abstraction rather than a neighbor, with a collection of documents relating to Phineas's Missouri employment. Emma learned about this from Phineas on a Tuesday morning when he rode over with a different quality of stillness about him, the kind that meant he was managing something large. "What do the documents show?" she asked. "My name attached to 3 property transactions in Missouri in 1872 and 1873, in which the company I worked for used lien methods to acquire homesteads. My name is on the paperwork as a witness and in one case as a messenger." He paused. "I was 24. I didn't know what I was witnessing or delivering. When I understood, I left within the month." "Can you prove that?" "I have letters," he said, "from the man who hired me, ironically. He wrote to me twice after I left, trying to convince me to come back, and the letters make clear both the date of my departure and the nature of what I'd refused to return to." "Then we need those letters," she said. "They're in my house," he said. "I've kept them for years. I always knew the day might come when I'd need them." She looked at him across the kitchen. "This is not going to break you," she said, with a certainty she felt in her bones. "I won't allow it." Something moved through his expression that she had no word for. "I know you mean that," he said. "I do," she said. They rode to his farm together, which was the first time she had been inside his house. It was larger than she'd expected, well-built and very clean, with the books on their shelf in the front room and a kitchen that was clearly the center of his domestic life. And the whole place had the particular quality of a space that has been inhabited thoughtfully by someone who cares about the details. It felt, she thought, like the inside of his mind. He found the letters in a locked box in his bedroom, and she read them carefully, and they were exactly what he had described, evidence of both his employment and the precise circumstances of his departure. They were also, she noticed, deeply sad documents in their way, the writing of a man trying to hold onto something he was in the process of losing, not understanding that the person on the other side of the correspondence had already made his choice. "These will be enough," she said. "I think so," he said. She looked up at him. He was standing in the doorway of his bedroom, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, and she was sitting at the small desk by the window with his past in her hands, and the intimacy of the moment went all the way down. "Phineas," she said. "I know," he said quietly. "No," she said. "I mean," she stopped, set the letters down carefully, stood up. "I love you," she said. "I need to say that before we go any further into resolving this, because I've been not saying it for months and I don't want to not say it anymore." The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds and felt like 3 years. "I love you," he said. "I've known it since the creek in October. I didn't know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything with it," she said, "except let me stay." He crossed the room in 3 steps and took her face in his hands, which were warm and slightly rough and terribly gentle, and he kissed her with the full weight of 5 months of carefully managed not kissing, and it was nothing like careful and everything like coming home. The legal resolution arrived in the 32nd week. Beaumont's challenge succeeded. The Sedgwick County Court found that the Meridian Land Company's lien on the Clara Waverly property had been improperly filed. The original documentation had failed to meet the notification requirements established by Kansas state law in 1876, and declared it void. The debt was nullified. The property was free and clear. Doc Harlan brought the news himself, riding out to Emma's house on a Wednesday morning with the document in hand, and a smile wide enough to show every tooth he possessed. Emma read it twice and sat down in the kitchen chair, and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was held that tight. The same week, the county sheriff's investigation into Phineas's Missouri history was concluded. Phineas's letters were presented as evidence, corroborated by a signed statement from the marshal in the Missouri County, where the original transactions had taken place, confirming that no charges had ever been filed against Phineas Hunter, and that he had in fact been noted in the county record as having reported the land company's practices to local authorities upon his departure. The investigation was closed. Denton Cray left Caldera Creek on a Thursday morning, quietly and without formal announcement, his bags on the first eastbound stage. Emma watched the stage go from Mrs. Tully's front porch and felt nothing except the clean relief of a resolved threat. In the 33rd week, with the legal matters settled and the property clear and the threat removed, Emma Shepard and Phineas Hunter sat on his front porch on a Sunday afternoon in late March, with the first real warmth of the Kansas spring coming up from the south, the tall grass beginning to green at its roots, the prairie opening itself back up after the winter's compression. And they talked about the future with the ease of people who have already made their essential decision and are now simply filling in the details. "The house is mine," Emma said. "I can sell it, or I can stay in it, or I can do something else with it." "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to stay in this county," she said, "in this particular spot on the map." "That's convenient," he said. "I live in this particular spot on the map." "I noticed," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Emma, I want to ask you something that I've been working up to for several weeks, and I want to ask it properly." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the prairie, his hands clasped between his knees, with the controlled stillness that she knew now meant something important was close to the surface. "I want you to marry me," he said. "Not because it's practical, though it is practical, and not because it resolves the question of where you live, though it does resolve that question, but because you are the person I want to spend my days with, because you are the most honest and capable and surprising person I've met in 30 years of meeting people, because that creek sounds better when you're beside it. Because I've been counting weeks since you arrived, Emma, and every week I counted I hoped was not the last one, and I don't want to count weeks anymore. I want to count years." She looked at him for a long, full moment in the spring air, and the tall grass was beginning to move in a warm wind from the south, and somewhere behind them his horses were making the quiet sounds horses make when they are content, and the world was very large and very clear. "Yes," she said, "I want that too." He reached over and took her hand. She laced her fingers through his. They sat there for a long time in the afternoon sun, in the particular silence that belongs to people who have arrived somewhere together and know it. They were married in the 36th week. The ceremony was held at the small Methodist church on the eastern edge of Caldera Creek's Main Street, on a Saturday morning in late April of 1879, with Doc Harlan as one witness and Mrs. Tully as the other. The minister was a man named Reverend Cole, who was slightly short-sighted and read his text with his nose very close to the page, which Phineas had warned her about in advance, and which she found, when it happened, more endearing than she'd expected. Emma wore the best dress she owned, a deep blue wool that she had taken in slightly at the waist over the winter, which had been good for her physically in all the ways frontier living tended to be. And she carried a bouquet of the first spring wildflowers, which she had picked herself from the creek bank that morning. Phineas wore his Sunday coat, which was dark and well cut and only slightly too warm for the April morning, and he stood at the front of the church with his hands clasped in front of him, and watched her walk toward him with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. The whole town came, or something close to it. Caldera Creek's population was perhaps 300, and Emma suspected at least 200 of them were in or around that church. She had not quite understood, until she saw them assembled, how thoroughly she had been absorbed into the community. How many of these people had become hers, quietly and without announcement, over 37 weeks of Saturday markets and Tuesday mornings cooking at Mrs. Tully's and Thursday evenings at the creek. After the ceremony, there was a gathering in the churchyard, with tables of food contributed by what appeared to be everyone, and music from a fiddle player named Garrett who played with a joy that was entirely unrelated to technical precision, and children running between the tables in the April sunshine, and the particular specific warmth of a community celebrating something that its members felt invested in. Doc Harlan gave a toast that was characteristically thoughtful and only slightly too long. Mrs. Tully gave a toast that was 3 sentences and perfect. Phineas's farmhand, a young man named Eli who had been with him for 2 years and had the quiet, observant quality of someone who notices everything and says little, shook Phineas's hand with both of his and said something in a low voice that made Phineas laugh, genuinely and freely. The kind of laugh that Emma had heard from him only a handful of times and that she loved unreasonably. She danced, which she had not done in years and which she discovered she was only slightly worse at than she remembered, and Phineas danced with her with the same careful attention he brought to everything, which meant he was not graceful but he was absolutely reliable, and she decided that was exactly the correct metaphor. Late in the afternoon, when the gathering had begun to wind down and the children had worn themselves into a pleasant exhaustion and the fiddle had gone quiet, she and Phineas stood at the edge of the churchyard looking east across the prairie toward his farm, their farm now, and the last of the April light was doing what it did in this country, turning everything gold and enormous. "It was supposed to be 1 week," she said. "I know," he said. "I counted." "How many weeks?" she asked. He turned to look at her with the hint of that not-quite smile she had been watching for since the 3rd morning she was here. 37, he said, before either of us mentioned it. She shook her head. "We wasted a lot of time being careful." "We didn't waste it," he said. "We just took it slowly." He paused. "I needed to take it slowly." "I know," she said. "I did too." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into the solid warmth of him, and the prairie went gold and then amber and then the first deep blue of evening, and she thought about Clara's letter, that she had found the kind of life she'd been trying to describe in all her previous letters, that she understood what she'd been looking for, and she thought, "I understand now, Clara. I think this is what you meant." The life they made together was not a simple or an easy one, because nothing on the Kansas frontier in the late 1870s was simple or easy, but it was a rich one in all the ways that mattered to them. Emma took Clara's house and, after some deliberation, did not sell it. Instead, she and Phineas converted it into a proper second structure for the expanded property. They eventually brought the 2 homesteads together under a single deed, which required a trip to the county land office in Wichita and an afternoon of satisfying paperwork, using it first for additional storage and later for a specific purpose that came to them together on a September evening about 4 months after the wedding. She had been thinking about the schoolhouse. Caldera Creek had been trying to fund a schoolhouse for 2 years, and the effort kept stalling because there was no building and no teacher, the 2 problems feeding each other in a circular frustration. Emma had taught herself to read properly by the time she was 5 and had always had, without particularly announcing it, a deep conviction about the importance of education. She had also, over the course of 37 weeks of frontier living, come to understand that the children of Caldera Creek, and there were many of them, the town's population skewed young in the way that growing frontier communities tended to do, were receiving an inconsistent and largely informal education that would not serve them well. "Clara's house," she said to Phineas that September evening. He looked up from the account book. "What about it?" "It's the right size for a school," she said. 2 rooms. Good light from the east windows, close enough to town that the children can walk it." He set down his pen. He looked at her with the expression that meant he was thinking seriously about something she had said and giving it the full weight it deserved. "You'd want to teach it yourself," he said. "I'd need help," she said. "I don't have a formal teaching certificate." "Doc Harlan has connections to the county school board," he said. "He's been trying to get a teacher sent from Topeka for 2 years. If we provide the building and you commit to teaching, the county might send the formal certification and a supplement." "That's what I was thinking," she said. He looked at her across the lamplit kitchen, and the warmth in his face was the particular kind that belonged to a man who is surprised, pleasantly and repeatedly, by the person he has chosen. "Let's do it," he said. The The Caldera Creek schoolhouse opened in January of 1880 in the 2 rooms of what had been Clara Waverly's house, with Emma Hunter. She had taken his name and found she liked the sound of it, the way it fit her as its first teacher. She had 23 students on the first day, ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she looked out at them across the rows of rough benches that Phineas and Eli had built over the course of 3 weekends in December, and she felt the full, specific weight of purpose. She taught reading and arithmetic and history, and on Fridays she taught what she called simply the world outside Kansas, which was geography and natural science and literature in equal measure, and the children came for it. They came in the cold and the mud of spring and the heat of summer and the wind of fall, and their parents came to her with gratitude that was sometimes expressed in words and more often in the jars of preserved fruit and the cuts of meat that appeared periodically on her schoolhouse steps. Phineas watched all of this with a steady, quiet pride that he expressed rarely in words, but constantly in action, making sure the schoolhouse was warm, maintaining the building, occasionally sitting in the back of the room on a Friday afternoon when she was reading aloud and listening with his arms crossed, and his face completely open in a way she had learned, was his particular expression of happiness. In the spring of 1880 she learned she was pregnant. She told Phineas on a Sunday morning in March, sitting across the kitchen table from him over coffee, and she watched his face go through something complicated and profound surprise, giving way to an emotion that was so large it seemed to take him a moment to contain it. He came around the table and pulled her up from her chair and held her, and she felt the tremor in him that he would not otherwise have allowed, the fullness of what he was feeling expressed in his hands against her back and the quality of his silence. "Are you happy?" she asked, because she needed to hear it. "More than I know what to do with," he said into her hair. "More than I've ever been." Their son was born in October of 1880. They named him James, after no one in particular, and both of them liked it. He arrived on a Tuesday morning during a clear October day that was so similar in quality to the October morning a year ago when she had first arrived at Clara's house that Emma, lying in the bed they shared in the farmhouse, while Doc Harlan and Mrs. Tully fussed competently around her, felt the full circle of it and was moved in a way she could not have explained. Phineas sat beside her bed through the whole of it, holding her hand with a steadiness that was the most useful thing anyone could have offered, and when James was placed in his arms for the first time his face did the thing it had done at the church, the thing she would remember forever, the complete and undefended expression of a man at the absolute center of his own life. James was loud and healthy and possessed of strong opinions from his first week, and Eli, who had taken on the role of devoted unofficial uncle with a naturalness that surprised no one, declared him the finest-looking child in Caldera Creek, which was an empirical judgment that Emma was willing to accept. The schoolhouse continued. Emma's teaching certificate arrived from Topeka in the spring of 1881, signed by the county school board, and with it came a small formal salary that she put directly into a fund for books, which was the most pressing need the school had. The spring of 1881 also brought a visit from Beaumont, the lawyer from Dodge City who had resolved the Meridian Land Company matter. He was passing through and stopped to deliver the final documentation confirming that the Meridian Land Company had, in the wake of Beaumont's challenge and several subsequent ones by other homesteaders, reached a settlement with the Sedgwick County Court and was no longer operating in Kansas. Emma received this news with considerable satisfaction. She also received, in a separate envelope that Beaumont handed her with a careful expression, a letter from a woman in Missouri named Martha Kellerman, the widow of the man who had lost 300 acres of creek bottom to the Meridian Company 2 years before Emma arrived. The letter was brief and formal, but its final paragraph said, "I understand you and your husband were instrumental in challenging the company that took our land. I want you to know that whatever comes of it, it mattered that someone tried." Emma read the letter twice and then sat for a long time at the kitchen table. And then she wrote back a letter of 3 pages that was the most honest thing she had written since arriving in Caldera Creek, including everything about Clara and the debt, and the 1-week plan that had become 37 weeks that had become a life. Martha Kellerman wrote back. They corresponded for years. James had a sister in 1883. They named her Clara, because by then the name had become something to honor rather than merely mourn, and Emma felt Clara Waverly's presence in Caldera Creek in the way she felt all the things she loved, as a warmth that had become structural, that you could lean against without thinking about it. Baby Clara was born on a Wednesday in June, arrived with the same strong opinions as her brother, and within a year had established herself as the decisive authority in every situation she entered, which did not surprise either of her parents. James, at 3, greeted his sister with the cautious assessment of a small person confronted with new information, and after a week of consideration, apparently decided she was acceptable, and from that point forward was her staunch and slightly exasperated champion in all things. Phineas watched his children with the same quality of attention he brought to everything: observant, present, fully engaged without being intrusive, and Emma watched him watching them and felt the particular species of love that is only available to people who have seen the person they love become more themselves through the years rather than less. By 1884, Caldera Creek had grown. New families had come, drawn by the railroad spur that had reached the area in 1882, and the town had a general store that was properly stocked, and a hotel that was a genuine hotel, and a blacksmith, and 2 churches, and the school, which now had 38 students and a second teacher. A young woman from Topeka named Miss Ruth Ansley, who had asked to be assigned to Caldera Creek specifically after hearing about the school's approach, which was a compliment that Emma received with complete satisfaction. The farm had grown too. Phineas had expanded the cattle operation steadily, adding to his herd each spring with careful attention to quality over quantity, and had added a small wheat acreage that proved, in good years, enormously productive. Eli had stayed, and they had added a second hand named Thomas, who was quiet and reliable and had the same affinity for horses that Phineas had, and the 4 of them ran the farm with an efficiency that left Phineas enough time in the evenings to sit with Emma on the porch after the children were in bed and do what they had always done best: talk and be still, and let the prairie make its wide, slow sounds around them. On a Saturday morning in October of 1884, 6 years, almost exactly, after Emma Shepard had stepped off the westbound stage from Abilene with $53 and a 1-week plan, she was at the Saturday market on Main Street with James, who was 4, and Clara, who was 1, and being carried on Emma's hip with the serene authority of a small person who has absolute confidence in their position. Phineas was at the market too, at his usual table, and Emma watched him across the market square, greeting neighbors, handing a small pumpkin to a child who had been looking at it with enormous longing, talking with Doc Harlan, older now, moving more slowly but still with the same cheerful intensity about something that was making them both laugh. She stood there in the October morning, her daughter on her hip, her son's hand in hers, and she looked at the man she had found in this place that she had not expected, and the town that had become hers in the space of 37 weeks of careful, accumulating, astonishing love, and she thought about all the ways the world had tried to keep this from her. The debt and the legal trap in Denton Cray and the dark past and the distance from everything familiar, and how none of it had managed it. Phineas looked up across the market square and found her without searching, the way people who know each other completely always seem to find each other in a crowd, and he smiled. Not the almost smile, the controlled predecessor to it, but the full one, the one that was just for her, the one that meant, "I see you. I chose this. I am glad." She smiled back. James pulled at her hand because he had spotted Doc Harlan's peppermint jar, which the old doctor kept stocked for exactly this purpose, and Clara made a sound of interest at nothing in particular, and the October prairie spread itself out behind the market square in gold and amber and bronze, and Emma Hunter walked toward her husband through the morning light. That evening, after James was in bed and Clara was asleep in her cradle in the corner of the bedroom, they sat on the porch in the October dark. The stars were extraordinary the way they were always extraordinary in Kansas, immense and unhurried, and the air had the sharp sweet cold of early autumn and the distant sound of the creek carried in the stillness. "Do you ever think about it?" Phineas asked. She knew what he meant. The 1 week," he confirmed. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I think about it the way I think about close calls," she said. "Like almost stepping off a ledge in the dark and then finding your foot in time." He made a sound of agreement. "I used to think about what would have happened if you'd taken Cray's offer in the first month," he said. "Or if Beaumont's challenge had failed, or if the winter had been hard enough to send you back east. But none of that happened," she said. "None of it happened," he agreed. "Because I kept finding reasons to stay," she said. "One more week and then one more. I kept counting them," he said. "I know," she said. "You told me." 37 before either of us mentioned it," he said. 37, she agreed. "And then we mentioned it and I thought the sky was going to come down." He laughed quietly. "So did I." She reached over in the dark and found his hand. He wrapped his fingers around hers, and they sat like that under the enormous Kansas stars, and the creek murmured to itself in the distance, and somewhere inside the house James said something in his sleep, and Clara made a small contented sound, and the night was full and still, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. It had started as 1 week. It had become a life. In the end, that was the truest and most complete accounting of it. Emma Shepard had come to Caldera Creek in September of 1878 to spend 1 week settling her dead sister's affairs, and she had stayed because a fence needed fixing, and a debt needed fighting, and a legal trap needed springing, and a dark past needed forgiving, and a man with a farm to the east had looked at her across a kitchen table in the lamplight, and shown her the full truth of himself without defenses. She had stayed because Caldera Creek had needed a teacher, and because Clara's house needed to be more than a monument to grief, and because 37 weeks of Saturday markets and creek bank silences and prairie winters and borrowed books had built something between them that neither one of them had been looking for, and neither one could have left behind. She had stayed because some places become yours not by birthright but by accumulated presence, by the specific weight of the days you have spent in them, by the people who see you clearly in them and choose you anyway. She had stayed because 30 years old and 26 years old and 2 careful, private, thoroughly complicated people had been, in the end, exactly what the other needed, and the prairie had known it before either of them did. Phineas Hunter had counted 37 weeks before either of them mentioned it. And then the count had changed, had shifted from weeks to years, from the arithmetic of postponement to the mathematics of accumulation, the compounding of ordinary days into an extraordinary life. In 1887, their third child arrived, a boy they named George, after George Waverly, who had been Clara's husband, and in whose memory the whole journey had begun. Doc Harlan, who had slowed considerably by then but showed no signs of retiring, declared him excellent. James, who was 7 and had very clear ideas about his position in the family hierarchy, took George's arrival with philosophical equanimity, and within a week had begun teaching him things, despite George's complete inability to do anything except exist with great determination. Clara, who was 4, announced that George was hers and would be cared for accordingly, and since this announcement was accompanied by a quality of intention that suggested it was not open to negotiation, everyone accepted it as established fact. Phineas held George on the first evening, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window in the same October light that had always seemed to Emma the particular light of their life, the light she had arrived in, the light they had married in, the light their first son had been born in, and he said nothing for a long time. Then he looked up at her and said, 3. she agreed. "We're going to need more rooms," he said. "We're going to need more rooms," she agreed. They added 2 rooms to the farmhouse that following summer, with help from what seemed like half of Caldera Creek, because that was the kind of town it had become and the kind of family they had become within it, connected outward in all directions through years of small acts and kept promises and the cumulative regard that comes from being, simply and consistently, the kind of people others want to help. The school had grown. The farm had grown. The town had grown. And in the center of all of it, like the fixed point around which a narrative organizes itself, there was the kitchen of the farmhouse east of Caldera Creek, where 2 people had arrived at the truth of each other over 37 weeks of careful, accumulating, quietly spectacular love. Emma Hunter, who had been Emma Shepard, who had come for 1 week, stood at the kitchen window on a morning in the autumn of 1887, watching Phineas walk across the yard toward the barn with George on his shoulders, and James running ahead of them both with the particular urgent purposefulness of a 7-year-old boy on a Saturday morning, and Clara following behind with the serene authority of a 4-year-old girl who has somewhere to be and fully intends to get there. The light was gold and the air was sharp and the prairie stretched out in every direction to the horizon, enormous and familiar, and she had never in her life been more entirely, unreservedly, bone-deep at home. 1 week, she thought. She was supposed to stay 1 week. He had counted 37 before either of them mentioned it, and then they had stopped counting weeks and started counting years, and the years had been more than either of them had allowed themselves to hope for, back at the beginning, when hope was still a word they spent carefully. She lifted her coffee cup and turned back to the kitchen and began her day.